Alrighty, in this video we are going to start working on our ability to return data from the server to the client. So if you guys recall, we've put together this IRPC response and IRPC response of T-result interfaces so that we can receive results from the server, but we haven't really implemented them a whole lot yet. Basically, at this point, so far, we have the interfaces defined, and we have some code that detects whether those interfaces are being used as the return value of a proxied method, but we haven't actually implemented any of the serialization or deserialization. Turns out that I apparently made a mistake with my implementation of these two interfaces that has pretty much been unnoticed until now because I've been kind of pushing aside this whole feature so that we could focus on getting everything working in Unity before we went back and started putting together the rest of our systems features. Well, I apologize about that, and this video we'll go ahead and we're going to set this straight. We're going to refactor these two interfaces and all the other code that uses them so far into a structure that'll actually work with what we want to do. Now, the reason why this won't work as it stands is, if you recall, the idea is that our server methods can return either void or IRPC response. Now, what's going to happen is when a client invokes a server operation, the method is going to immediately return and continue on executing the client code. And obviously, because the server is going to need some time to respond, be it 10 milliseconds, 20 milliseconds, 50 milliseconds, and we don't want to pause the code while the execution is, or we don't want to pause the client when it could be doing some useful things, just waiting on a server response. We've actually already seen this with our client and server code, where we're able to return operation responses. But we haven't yet quite actually made the interface in a way that'll work on the client, because we have to ask ourselves, okay, how do we want the client to consume the responses? And the way I've been wanting to write this is to make it as easy as possible. I don't want to have any callback stuff. I want all the callback stuff to be handled by the framework itself. I don't want to deal with any of that stuff. So instead, what I want to do is I want to make the client consuming these APIs very straightforward. Basically, the end result is I want the client to be able to execute a method on the server and then provide a callback method in the form, typically in the form of a multi-line lambda, that will receive the result when the server finally gets around to actually sending us back a result. So if you guys are familiar with common JavaScript patterns, this is going to be very similar to the promise pattern, where we kind of shoot off an asynchronous operation, and in that same line of code, we will say, okay, when you're done with that asynchronous operation, I want you to invoke this method. Right, we don't want to invoke the result method before we get the server results. And obviously the IRPC response isn't going to work very well because, as you see, the data is right there. So what will be returned back to the client code? It has to be an object. But that object can't have the actual things like operation errors or is valid because it doesn't know that yet. It won't know that until the server gets back to it. So what we need to do is we need to get rid of this IRPC response interface and replace it with an interface that has methods on it that allow us to basically be able to attach callbacks to the server code so that when the server finally gets around to returning a result, we can invoke the callbacks. We'll still have an RPC response, but it turns out we don't need to make that into an interface. The thing we need to make into an interface is the wrapper around the RPC response. And that's because on both the client and the server, you need to return an actual object. But the object that's going to be returned by the server is just going to be a wrapper around an RPC response, and the object returned by the client is going to be a deferred wrapper around an RPC response, as in an object that will collect callbacks, and then when it's provided a response, it'll invoke the proper callbacks. So what we need to do here is we need to do basically two things here. We need to go ahead and basically nuke the IRPC response interface. We then need to create our actual interfaces that we're going to use as the wrapper. And we also need to create the actual RPC response class, because we're going to have two RPC responses classes, just like we have here with our response of result and our non-generic version. And then we're also going to have to create a handful of other methods or other classes that allow us to provide implementations for them. One set for the server and one set for the client. So in this video, I kind of want to perform this refactoring and just go through it class by class and talk about what we're doing with it, then fix all the code that we're inevitably going to break with our changes. And then if we have time, we can put together a test case of how this feature is even going to be used in the first place. And then once we have that test case written, we can actually finally finish the implementation of this feature, and everything will be super amazing and awesome. So some of this is going to be challenging due to the way that we want to be able to support both responses that have results and responses that don't have results. But I think I've came up with a decent enough way to handle all that stuff. So let's go ahead and get started. Basically what I'm going to do first is I'm just going to grab our IRPC response and IRPC response tick1 out of our infrastructure namespace, and I'm just going to delete them. So now they're gone. You'll notice that I now have 28 errors and 7 files. That's okay. We'll go and we'll fix the code that those two interfaces depended on, one file at a time, once we get the class structure that we want written. So there's going to be an interesting circular dependency between these classes, and it's basically a very tight-knit design that I came up with, and so we're going to jump around a little bit between the files, but I do want to get all of the files just written out first, all the classes that we're going to need to support this framework. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start off with the infrastructure namespace. I'm going to start off with the IRPC method. So I'm going to create a new interface, and it's going to be IRPC method. So this method this interface is what we're going to now use instead of void when we want to have the server return a response to the client. So what we're going to do on it is we're going to provide methods that we can invoke that'll queue up callbacks for those callbacks to be invoked when the server actually comes and responds with the message. Now, I'm going to have them all return an IRPC method so that the interface is chainable. If you're familiar with like a jQuery syntax, for example, or a link syntax, you know, that's kind of what you do. You chain things together. And it's just a syntactical convenience. I just don't want anyone to get confused as to why these methods are going to be returning an IRPC method, because, again, we're just doing that so we can chain multiple invocations into one line. Which can increase readability in this particular case. So we're going to have a few ones. We're going to have done, which will have one parameter, which will be action of IRPC method on done. So what does the done method do? The done method simply queues up a delegate to be invoked when the server gets back to it. We're going to have a fail called onFail. So what is fail? Well, if you recall, our RPC response has this concept of whether or not the operation succeeded. For example, could you log in with these credentials? Maybe you couldn't, blah, blah, blah. So what we're going to do is the done callbacks will be invoked if isValid is true, and the fail callbacks will be invoked if isValid is false. It's just really a convenience so that we don't have to write a condition inside of our code to detect those two things. But what if we want to have code that'll always execute, regardless of if the operation was a failure? Well, we're going to do that as well. I'm going to do an IRPC method always. And again, if you're familiar with the Promise API, this is very similar. So we have done, fail, and always, and you know what, I think I could just leave it at that. I also could have a one that supports multiple actions, like passing in done and a fail into the same method. I think I want to avoid that. I might change my mind in the future, but I think this will be a little bit more clear as far as the intent of what's going on. So we'll have done, fail, and always. And with that, we can do whatever we need to on the IRPC method. And these actions, I accidentally, wow, I'm just on a roll here tonight, aren't I? I didn't mean these actions to accept an IRPC method. I meant them to receive an RPC result, which is a class that doesn't exist yet. So just let it be read like that. So again, these are delegates that return or receive an RPC result, and these delegates will only be invoked when the server responds to the operation, and then the client framework creates an RPC result out of it, and then invokes the queued methods. So that's our IRPC method, but I also want to be able to support RPC results with responses. So I'm going to create another interface, and it's going to be called IRPC method tick1. And of course, we'll remove that tick1 from there, and we'll add tResult in the as a generic parameter. Now, IRPC method, I don't want IRPC method to inherit from RPC method. That would be a that would just make things look really ugly. This kind of gets into the convoluted design of this class structure. It's a fairly convoluted design that might take a few tries to kind of get a grasp on because of all the constraints that I have working against me to make this work. But remember, the whole goal of this is to make this transparent for the user of the framework. I'm not always against ugly design as long as it exists in order to make the client code cleaner. So IRPC method will not inherit from the other IRPC method. And one of the reasons is we're also going to provide a IRPC method tResult done that has an action. But the delegates that this interface is going to accept are going to be actions that receive a RPC result of tResult. Like that. So it's basically the exact same API, it's just using a different type. And that's that. So that's our IRPC method tick1, and that's our IRPC method. And with these two, we'll be able to do a lot of fun stuff. Okay, so we've done that. Now let's start talking about our RPC result. So now we're actually going to go in and implement a real RPC result. But you'll notice that this will be, again, slightly different than what you might expect. So inside of our infrastructure namespace, we're going to create a new class. So this is going to be a class, not an interface. And I'm going to call it RPC result. And RPC result is not going to inherit from anything. And we're going to start off with the obvious things. We're going to have a public IEnumerable of string. Well, actually, I am curious. Give me 1 second. I want to look something up real fast. I'm going to look at our client context. I want to look at this. Operation errors. Well, yeah, I don't care. Okay, it's going to be an IEnumerable of string operation errors with a public getter that returns operation errors. And of course, we'll have to have a private read-only. We're going to do a list of string operation errors. So we have a field operation errors, and we also have our property, but our property exposes it as an IEnumerable. Then we're going to have the public bool is valid with a get and a private set. Then we're going to have a public object untyped result. Now, this untyped result object is really just a small little kludge that I'm putting in order to make our writing our client context a little easier. If you recall, we use the untyped result here. And that's because if I put on, I think I've already discussed this actually. If on the generic version of RPC result has a property called result of the generic type, the only way to access that is going to be through reflection. And I don't want to deal with that. So kind of as a kludge, I have this untyped result object, which will make some of the framework code a little bit easier to read. we can safely ignore it in the case of a RPC result that doesn't have a result. Or actually, why am I calling these RPC results? I think RPC responses are better. I don't care. RPC results, fine. Okay, so we have our untyped result. Now we need a constructor, so public RPC result, and our constructor is going to take in a something. Let's do a string array of operation errors, or how about a boolean is valid and a string array of operation errors. Is valid will equal is valid. Operation errors will equal new list of string, passing in operation errors to copy from. And of course, I have to set the field, not the property. Okay, so we now have that all figured out. I'm also going to provide a protected RPC result constructor that has bool is valid, string operation errors, and then object untyped result. And this will simply invoke this, passing in is valid and operation errors, and then I'll also set untyped result to untyped result. So this protected constructor will be used by our other RPC, our generic RPC result. Okay, so that's pretty much all we need. Our operation errors is valid and untyped result, but we also need something else. The reason we need something else is I want a very convenient way of constructing the class that implements this sort of wrapper. So remember we have the RPC method that's a sort of wrapper around our RPC result. Well, I want a very convenient way to create one of them. And we're going to need two implementations, a deferred one and a in-processed one. So what do I mean by that? Well, when we invoke a method on the server that returns an IRPC method, it needs to return an object of IRPC method, right? Because, like, let's say on our login on our server, our login method needs to return a result, so it needs to return an object of type IRPC method. So we need to create sort of a dummy wrapper around IRPC method so that our server can return those objects and then have those objects be unpackaged, serialized, sent back to the client so that the client's wrapper around IRPC method can be invoked. So we do need a sort of what I call in-process RPC method that just is a wrapper around a result. So don't close your RPC result class just yet, because we're going to come back to this once we implement our sort of dummy RPC method. So inside of our RPC method class, so inside of our infrastructure namespace, I'm going to create a in-process RPC method, and he's going to implement IRPC method, and then I'm just going to go ahead and implement all of his methods. Now, what I am going to do is I am going to leave all of these throwing new not implemented exceptions. Now, the reason for that is that on the server, there's no need to invoke any of these methods. These methods are only for the convenience of the client, not the server. I will, however, go ahead and add a public RPC result, and I'll go ahead and just call this result get private set, and then I'll create a constructor that simply accepts RPC result as a parameter. So now our in-process RPC method it's basically a wrapper around our RPC result, and that's how that'll work. So now let's go ahead and jump back into our RPC result class. And the reason we're jumping back into this class is as a very simple convenience for people who are writing code. I want to create a very easy way, a single method call that allows us to create a new in-process RPC method object, wrapping an RPC result so that we can do so that things are just cleaner inside of our methods. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say we have a login method somewhere. Like, let's say we have a method like public IRPC method login string username string password, right? And so we might say if password equals blah, then we want to return an RPC result from this. So how do we want to do this? Well, we could say return new in process RPC method new RPC result true, specifying that it was a success, and then if there was a failure, return new in process RPC method new RPC result false, passing in an operation error of password is wrong, for example. So we could have our server-side code look like this. Instead, I want it to look like this. I'll say if password equals blah, then return RPC result dot valid or success. Otherwise, return RPC result dot fail. Password is wrong. So basically what I'm saying is I want to be able to, instead of having to instantiate these in-process RPC method objects manually like this, which looks really ugly and obfuscates the code, I just want to be able to say return RPC result.success or return RPC result.fail, just to make things a little cleaner. So now that we have our RPC or in-process RPC method class written, we can now make that work on our RPC result. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say public static IRPC method, and I'm going to say success. And actually, I'm just going to say I'm going to say public static. Let's make it a method. I'm just going to make it a method. So return new in-process RPC method, return new RPC result, is valid true, and then operation errors, I'm actually going to say enumerable dot empty string, but what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to change our string constructor to accept an IEnumerable of string rather than a okay. So what I did was in the constructor of RPC result, instead of accepting an array, I accepted an IEnumerable, which is more appropriate anyway. Then I'm going to have a public static IRPC method dot fail. It's going to have a params string array operation errors, and it's going to return a new in-process RPC method new RPC result false operation errors. And that'll just clean everything up and make our server-side code look a little nicer. Okay, so now that we've done our non-generic RPC result, we now have to do our generic RPC result, which is going to require the introduction of two new classes. One new class is going to be another in-process RPC method, and another new class is going to be the actual RPC result. So let's come back into infrastructure, and let's create a new class, and I'm going to call this RPC result tick1. And it's going to have a T result, and it's going to inherit from RPC result. Now, we will need a constructor on this RPC result. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say public RPC result bool is valid, IEnumerable, which brings in link, string operation errors, and then it's also going to accept a T result. And what this is going to do is it's going to invoke base is valid operation errors result. In addition, in the constructor, I'm also going to have a I'm going to set a property, but let's go ahead and create that property first. So I'm going to say public T result get private set, and in the constructor I'm going to say result equals result. Now, unfortunately, the only way to instantiate this, it will be through reflection, but fortunately, we'll only have to do that on the client, and we'll see that code. Well, we'll deal with that code when we get to it. Okay, so now we need to create another in-process RPC method class, and that's going to be the generic form of it. So let's go back to our infrastructure namespace and create a new class, and it's going to be RPC or in-process RPC method tick1, which will have a T result, And now in-process RPC method is going to inherit from in-process RPC method. And of course, we'll need a constructor. So I'll say public in-process RPC method tResult result, or sorry, RPC result of type tResult result, which will invoke the base passing in result. Now, in-process RPC method tick1 is not going to actually have to do anything because we're passing the RPC result object back into the base, and since RPC result of tResult inherits from RPC result, we can just leave the code as it is, and we'll be fine. So you'll see how this is used later. In-process RPC method is a infrastructure class. It's a class that's not going to be used by anything other than the framework. And in fact, will be pretty much hidden from everything within our code. So I don't really care if it's ugly. Okay, so now let's go back to RPC result of type RPC result, and let's create our static methods, our factory methods, like what we did for the original RPC result. So I'm going to say public static, then I'm going to say new success. Actually, I shouldn't have to specify new success, so I won't do that. And tResult result, or public static derp IRPC method of tResult success, and it's simply going to return a new in-process RPC method of type tResult result as the, or sorry, new RPC result of type tResult, true enumerable dot empty string and result. So what are we doing here? Well, this will throw an error. I know why it's throwing an error. We'll fix it in a second, but let me go ahead and explain this line of code first. So what does success do? Well, success simply receives a result of that type that we want to, and it basically just instantiates a new RPC result of type T, and then it wraps it in an in-process RPC method of type T. Which, the in-process RPC method might not even be necessary, now that I think about it. But we'll just leave it as it is. No, it is necessary, and the reason it's necessary is because IRPC method, we need to return an object that implements IRPC method of type T. That's why we have this in-process RPC method, to make the types work. So coming back over here to the in-process RPC method of 1, we can go ahead and also make it implement IRPC method of tResult. And then in doing so, we have to go ahead and implement our 3 methods, our done, our fail, and our always. So, and we'll leave them as throwing new not implemented exceptions. Anyway, this is a very ugly type hierarchy that I'm not a big fan of, but it'll work. And some of the craziness we're doing with the type system right now is kind of necessary to get the effect that I want. So we're bending things just a little bit. Anyway, now that we have our success method, let's make our failure method. So public static IRPC method tResult of fail. And fail is going to have a params string array operation errors. And it's simply going to return a new in-process RPC method, new RPC result, false operation errors, and fortunately we can't do null, but we can do default tResult, which will be null for, if tResult is a value type, it'll be the default of that value type. If tResult is a reference type, it'll be null. Okay, so that was lots of fun. I mean, not really, but... Oh yeah, we do need to specify that... Thank you, Resharper, for that. We do need to say public static new fail, so that we hide the fail in the thing that we're inheriting. Anyway, very, very, very convoluted type hierarchy, and I apologize, but there's not a whole lot of code to it, and again, it'll make things work the way that we want them to on the actual client. So now that we've done that, we've pretty much implemented the type hierarchy. There's actually one more or 2 more classes that I kind of want to put together. And these two classes are going to be very, very simple and straightforward, fortunately. yeah, stuff and things. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and close out of all this stuff. Okay, so the two classes we need are the deferred RPC methods. So these are the RPC method objects that are going to be instantiated on the client side. So I'm going to say DEFE RPC method, which will implement iRPC method, and we'll go ahead and implement all of the members, done, fail, and always. And what we're going to do here is we're going to need 3 lists. So we're going to need a private read-only list of action of RPC response or result. We'll want done actions, private read-only list action, RPC result, fail actions, and private read-only list action. Actually, you know what? We'll just do done actions and fail actions. Okay, so then we need a constructor that's going to instantiate both our done actions and our fail actions. Now we need to implement our done, fail, and always. Done simply says done actions.add on done. Return this. Fail says fail actions add on fail. Return this. And always will say done actions add on always. And then fail actions dot add on always. And then return this, or this. Now the last thing we need to do is we need to write a method that'll be able to fulfill our RPC responses on all of our callbacks. So up here after the constructor, I'm going to say public void set response with RPC, or set result rather. RPC result, and I'm simply going to say if result dot is valid, then for each var done in done actions done result, otherwise for each var fail in fail actions fail result. So all pretty straightforward. Now let's go ahead and do our deferred RPC method of tResult. So new class, deferred RPC method tick1 tResult. I'm going to have this go ahead and inherit from deferred RPC method and then have it implement iRPC method of type tResult. And then I'll go ahead and implement all of the members. Now this is going to be very easy. All I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap the other ones. I'm going to wrap the inherited functions. So I'm going to say base dot done, res goes into on done, deferred RPC method tResult, res, return this. That one is not like. Cannot cast of expression, RPC result to, or whoops. There we go, thank you type system. Alright, so then we're going to do on fail, we'll do base fail, res goes into on fail, passing in a cast to RPC result, tResult, res, return this, and then always we'll just do base always. Res on always, passing in a cast to RPC result of tResult, passing in res, and return this. So why am I doing it like this? Well, the reason I'm doing it like this is because I could just as easily have not inherited from deferred RPC method and just done the whole same thing that we did in deferred RPC method. The reason I'm not doing that is that'll actually make the client implementation easier. We'll have to do less generic reflection in order to build up the client side of this framework. Okay, so yeah. Super fun stuff. Now that we have this really terrible and ugly class hierarchy put together that I hopefully never have to look at again, Let's go ahead and fix up our errors. So let's start with our mapped method. So remember our mapped method? Well, this gets a little bit interesting. RPC method. How are we going to return an RPC response? Let's just go ahead and return object from invoke. Okay, let's just start off in mapped method under infrastructure mapped method. We're going to have to change quite a few things here. So let's just follow down the red. First thing, invoke. I'm no longer going to have an IRPC response. I'm going to return an object. The reason for that is that it might be an IRPC response or an IRPC response with a result. Both of those interfaces are not compatible with each other. In fact, they're completely separate interfaces. So I'm just going to go to the lowest common denominator and have object. Next up, how do we determine if we need to return a response? Well, we can't see if its return type is IRPC response anymore because that return type doesn't exist. Instead, we're going to do if its type of IRPC method. Now, how do we determine what kind of result it has? Well, instead of checking to see if it's the generic version of IRPC response, we can check to see if it's the generic version of IRPC method. And that fixes all that code. Now we need to change our compile method invoker. So instead of returning IRPC response, it's going to return object. And then down here, instead of creating a lambda of IRPC response, we're going to return a lambda of object. And that's it. Okay, so let's go to the next set of errors. iSystems operation writer on the systems. Actions of IRPC response on response. This action is now going to be an action of RPC result on response. And remember, this is in our client systems iSystems operation writer. All right. Now let's go to our system operation writer implementation, and we're going to change the invoke method to returning instead of an IRPC response, we're going to turn an RPC result. And then on our parse response, instead of having an action of IRPC response, we're going to have an action of RPC result for our actual on response. The on response method being what we're going to invoke once we parse out the RPC result from the return type. Moving along, on our Buzz MMO server client context, that's the server project client context class, we now have to fix all this code. So the result right here is saying equals method.invoke system object.arguments. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to say if result, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say something like, I'm going to say var in process result equals result. So this is, again, on the invoke method on system method in our client context, the thing that actually invokes the method system that the client requested. I'm going to say in process result equals result as in process RPC method. Then I'm going to say if in process RPC result equals null, then throw new invalid operation exception saying that please return an in process RPC method by the RPC result.success or RPC result.fail methods. Okay, so now we have our in-process result. We can now, instead of doing result.isValid, because now result is an object, I can do in-process result.result.isValid, and I can do in-process result.result.operation errors. And then finally, instead of doing result.untyped result, I can do in-process result.result.untyped result. And because of the ridiculously ugly type hierarchy we have, this will just magically work. We have one more file with errors in it, and that is going to be our component map tests. So you see how I have this IRPC response everywhere? Well, this is actually going to be easy to fix, because now I can simply say IRPC method instead of IRPC response. Furthermore, we have our test RPC response. I'm going to delete its entire body and have it implement IRPC method, and then I'm going to implement all the members, and I'm going to leave them all unimplemented on our test RPC response. Then I'm going to do the same thing on our test RPC response of T, replace it with IRPC method, and implement all of the members as throwing not implemented exceptions. Finally, on our test component 7, we're simply going to replace IRPC response with IRPC method everywhere that we see. And that now works. And now everything compiles. So again, all we did on our component map test was switch over IRPC method for IRPC result. That was it. Now let's go ahead and run our tests. Resharper, I need to run all tests from solution. I really need to memorize that shortcut. Okay, let's go ahead and run all of our tests. And we get success. So everything is still working in the exact way that we want it to. So yeah, I think that pretty much wraps this video up. We've basically, all we've done is we've gone through and we've fleshed out our object graph or our class hierarchy for how our RPC methods and RPC results are going to work. I know it's a bit ugly, but it'll work, it'll serve us well, and in the next video we'll actually go and finally implement this entire ability to return objects or return data. So we'll see you guys in the next video.